I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare Anyone? Hi, listeners. Elyse here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Kourtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Kourtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/ShakespeareAnyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode. Hi, Kourtney.
Hi, Elyse.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, too. It was fun to get back into the swing of things after our research hiatus, after our little summer break.
Yes.
I was like, oh, I haven't lost it.
I know. Me neither. I'm just like going through these sources like da-da-da-da-da-da. So, yeah, we still got it. And we've got something really interesting for everyone, I think.
Yeah, I've talked about this with you a lot, but I'm seeing Much Ado Done a lot around the world this year. And one of the things I hear about it is when people go, oh, like it's funny, but the sexism in there. And like the way the women are treated, if you really think about it, it's kind of cringy. And so we are going to explore the tropes that are gender-based in today's episode and talk about that sexism that is seen, especially by modern audiences, in this text today.
Mm-hmm.
So to start off with, I'm going to just kind of give a brief overview. This comes from Harry Berger's article, Against the Syncopace, Sexual and Family Politics in Much Ado About Nothing. And in this play, Harry sets up, like I know him, Harry. Berger sets up the idea of the difference between Beatrice and Hero in terms of how they act and how they respond to the early modern gender norms that they are expected to behave in. And we've talked in other episodes about the expectations that were put on women in the early modern era and what the ideal woman was. And Benedict talks a lot about his ideal woman, and women are supposed to be kind and quiet and subservient to men. And while throughout Shakespeare we see plenty of women who aren't, Beatrice being one of them. Hero, Berger points out, is mostly silent in the first acts of this play, which puts her in sharp contrast to Beatrice, who is very noisy, says a lot. However, Hero, in the absence of Beatrice and her father, is much more talkative. We see her leading conversations and sort of taking on a parallel position to the prince, Don Pedro, in the gulling of Beatrice, whereas Don Pedro is the ringleader of the plot to trick Benedict. Hero is the leader of the parallel plot against Beatrice, and we definitely see some language from her that suggests that she does not approve of Beatrice's behavior and the way that Beatrice talks. She seems to have an awareness of the limitations that the culture she's been born into places on women. However, she does not rebel against them in the way that Beatrice does. She is mindful of her parents, and she is wanting marriage, and Hero also seems to simultaneously, as I've said, while she disapproves of Beatrice's rebellious behavior and how Beatrice does not want to get married, she also has an admiration for her and expresses that. So she's a very interesting early modern depiction of a woman who's aware of her place in society and what society expects of her, and is choosing that she could choose to rebel like her cousin, but is choosing to be the dutiful wife and daughter and go down that path.
Yeah. And that's visible from, especially I'm thinking about the wedding scene and the way the hero reacts to finding out that there is this claim that she is not virtuous, versus how Beatrice reacts to it, where Hero does say stuff, but she's kind of not accepting of the circumstances, but she doesn't push back and fight for her honor in that moment.
Yes.
Versus Beatrice, who tells Benedict that she wishes she were a man because then she would fight for Hero's honor. So they have very different ways of processing and wanting to deal with these things.
Hero also does defend herself in that moment. You know, she tells the truth. I spoke with no man at that hour, my lord. And the men use that. Like, there's nothing she could have done.
Yeah.
In their mind, she is guilty. And then when she does defend herself, they call her a liar. So there's really no winning with Don Pedro and Claudio in that moment.
And I guess what I mean is that she seems to just accept that there's a limitation to what her word will do.
What she can do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's not like Beatrice going, I wish I could duel him like men could for her honor.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of men, in this play, men across the social classes are allowed to be fallible. While Don John is ultimately, shrugged off with what he's done, we've captured him. We'll devise brave punishments for him, but, tonight let's dance is at the end of the play. Don Pedro and Claudio are forgiven for the slander that they do against Hero. Dogberry is an incredibly fallible man and makes mistakes left and right, and yet there is no punishment.
Removal from his position and power.
Nope, it's just accepted. Berger says, quote, "Male deception and inconstancy are gifts that God gives, and their proper name is manhood. But woman has an awesome responsibility. She is expected to conquer blood with wisdom," unquote. So she's expected to be just consistently wise, consistently temperate, never give in to passion. And that is something that God gives men, and men are allowed to do. And men are allowed to make mistakes, cheat. And we can see this sort of expectation also set up in King Lear, where Gloucester refers to Edmund as a whoreson. Berger says, quote, "The father's language identifies the mother as a whore and Edmund as not his bastard, but as her son," unquote. So multiple times in Shakespeare, we get this depiction of men can kind of do whatever they want, and women are expected to be better than they are. And the inversion of that idea, you did some research on the trope of cuckoldry, and you have more to say on that.
I do, yes. Cuckoldry is an interesting topic in this play, in particular because it is a part of the main plot. Claudio believes himself to be cuckolded, and Benedict is very afraid of being cuckolded. Mm-hmm. He chooses to live a bachelor life because he thinks instinctively like marriage and cuckoldry go hand in hand. But then we also see Shakespeare plays that are tragedies that have very explosive plot points, but this is a comedy. And so I want to go into what cuckoldry is and talk a bit about how cuckoldry exists in this particular play. And let me lay out what cuckoldry is. So cuckoldry has been recognized as a common motif in Shakespearean dramas. And it's important to note that, like, we talk a lot about the anxieties that early modern men had, or the ones that we see written down, either in pamphlets, in books, in plays. The prevalence of female marital infidelity in Elizabethan England is a difficult one to quantify. We don't actually know how many women were cheating on their husbands, having affairs, how many men were cuckolded. But this fear had a cultural significance. So cuckoldry is simply when a woman will cheat on, have an affair with another man. The husband of the wife is the cuckold. He has been betrayed by his wife, and it's a degradation to his masculinity. Cuckoldry represented a danger to the sanctity of marriage. Cuckoldry threatened the security of paternity and patrilineal inheritance.
Which we've definitely talked about the
Yes.
anxieties of patrilineal inheritance before. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So this idea that a man could never be sure that his children and heirs were his own. And even though it's a small talking point in Much Ado, there is a conversation between Leonato, Don Pedro, and Benedict where Don Pedro recognizes Hero as being Leonato's daughter, saying that she looks like Leonato, and Leonato makes this what I interpret as a joke about her mother tells me so, like, that she's my daughter, you know.
Yes.
And then Benedict gets a bit worried about this, but that was an element to it as well, was this like paternity and patrilineage. Cuckoldry was also a threat to social status and masculinity, and the unfaithful wife was also an affront to the patriarchal social order. This is associated in the popular imagination with female subordination, this anxiety men have around women, more specifically around wives. And one of the questions that you all might be thinking, why do cuckolds have horns? What is up with that?
Yeah. What is up with that?
What is up with that?
Where did that come from?
In Much Ado, we have quotes such as Benedict saying, "The savage bull may, but ever the sensible Benedict bear it, pluck off the bull's horns and set them in my forehead, and let me be vilely painted, and in such great letters as they write, here is good horses to hire, let them signify under my sign. Here you may see Benedict, the married man." Exactly. Yep. And so that is painted throughout this play. There are references to this horned man, this cuckold. So I have two articles that I read. One of them is called "Why Do Cuckolds Have Horns?" by Claire McEachern. Well, first of all, fun fact, Claire McEachern wrote the introduction for the Arden 5th edition of Much Ado. And this is from another article from another publication. But she frames this article by noting that Samuel Johnson wrote of Shakespeare's horn jokes, quote, "There is no image which our author appears so fond of as that of a cuckold's horns. Scarcely a light character is introduced that does not endeavor to produce a merriment by some allusion of horned husbands," unquote. So even if Much Ado is not necessarily an Othello or a Winter's Tale or Cymbeline, Shakespeare likes to bring it all back to cuckoldry.
Clowns often joke about cuckoldry.
And the cuckold was a popular trope in the 16th and 17th centuries, but this literary character goes back at least as far as the medieval fabliau, which is a body metrical tale, and it is the source for comedy and drama. Even up to this day, I'm thinking of King of the Hill with Dale, Nancy, and John Redcorn, and Dale is cuckolded by Nancy with John Redcorn, and it's a moment of comedy in the show because he's the only one who doesn't know that that is what is going on in this relationship. And I'm sure you can all think of other cuckoldry relationships that are more modern. And explanations for the high rate of horns in the early modern period share a model of displacement. So it's often analyzed as being a response to some social development. So it could be something that's psychological, patriarchal, economic, theatrical. And the horn in this displacement model mediates cultural anxiety with the extrusion of horns from the body as a release of some social tension. There will be like language about how horns are coming out of the forehead. And this is language that's used a lot in comedies. And when it's seen in comedies, the comedy of the cuckold is transmuting a deeper fear into a more lighthearted one. And so we laugh at the cuckold, not with him. And the horniness of the cuckolder ends up manifesting on the brow of the insufficiently masculine cuckoldy, like I said. So it's the image of like bulls, stags, goats.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one like possible explanation for why cuckoldry is a trope in 16th and 17th century drama. And McEachern also added one that she talked about a lot in her article, but I'm not going to bring that up, like expand on that for the purposes of this episode. But she also adds an explanation for the prevalence of horn humor in the period, which is the Reformation. So there are all these conundrums posed by the problem of reading your own salvation in the displaced signs of selfhood. What the horn displaces is a form of anxiety or uncertainty surrounding salvation. Like, we don't solidly know exactly why this cuckoldry trope is so prevalent in the early modern era. It's attributed to all sorts of anxieties, a lot of them oftentimes patriarchal, but there could be other reasons as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's framing like the fact that there's anxiety and there are potential reasons for it. But I want to talk about the origins of the word cuckold because it's pretty interesting to me. The word cuckold derives from the word cuckoo, which is a bird and not a horned animal.
Huh.
Yes, and the cuckoo lays its eggs in another's nest, thus delegating the labor of brooding and rearing.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, now that makes sense.
But like you go, why horns? Why horns? And the potential reason for that is because the German term for cuckold comes from the word capon, and it derives, quote, from the practice formerly prevalent of planting or engrafting the spurs, so like the outgrowth of bone on a rooster's leg, of a castrated cock on the root of the excised comb, so the crest of the head, where they grew and became horns, sometimes of several inches long, unquote. And I don't know much about this husbandry practice, but this is the link.
So it's through this rooster husbandry practice. Not only is like a cuckoo bird coming in and putting their eggs in your nest, but also you are now a castrated rooster who has these horns.
Yes.
Gotcha.
And an alternative account explains that the origin to the horns is from the Greek emperor Andronicus, who was known to place horns on the houses of his conquests in order to signify his grant of compensatory hunting privileges to their husbands. So we've conquered and we're inviting you to go hunt. I'm going to put this horn on. And by the Renaissance, the practice of nailing horns to the door of a suspected cuckold suggested that the horning became scornful. So if you were suspected of being a cuckold, I guess folks in town would nail horns to the door.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's very much a public shaming.
Like to tease you or to like let you know, but both, like it's because it's also like a shame. Like, wow.
You know, and I don't know that, but that does
Yeah.
loop into this idea that like the cuckolded stage character oftentimes doesn't know that they're a cuckold, and it's everyone else knowing or the audience knowing.
Right.
Like, I'm laughing at you because you don't know that this is happening, but I do.
Okay.
And then another source that's most often cited for like the Renaissance origin is Ovid's Diana and Actaeon from Metamorphoses. And in this tale, long tale short, the goddess punishes Actaeon by transforming him into an antlered stag, who is then killed by his hounds. And in the Greek cuckoldry, the horns are antler. Are there antlers, not like cattle
or cow.
or goat? Yeah. And these antlers were more an emblem of female domination and not phallic power. But most Renaissance cuckolds do not sprout antlers. They instead have bovine horns. Shakespeare, for example, references cattle and sheep horns like savage bulls, cursed cows, horns of plenty. And there are more references to hunting horns and antlers in his plays. And Benedict says that it is possible to, quote, wear one's cap with suspicion, unquote, assuming the horns will fit under the cap. So trying to hide these horns. And in the early modern period, Nicholas Breton's Cornucopia celebrated cuckoldry on the grounds of its inevitability by describing a temple consecrated to Lady Fortune at Cuckold's Point, in which her monument is not a wheel but a horned pillar. So cuckold horns were domesticated in this instance versus it being like the wild stag. And in the Renaissance period, female liability is not as threatening as a goddess is, like Diana, because it's more like the common woman, the mortal woman, I suppose, in Renaissance without the god and goddesses.
The domestic woman.
The domestic woman, yeah. And then you might be thinking, well, why bovine horns? And McEachern posits that the bovine horn was additionally used for all sorts of material purposes in the early modern period. Its light-bearing properties, when polished, were materials for windows and lanterns. Its transparency made it a feature for the horn book, which is that like single-sided alphabet primer that contained letters and numbers. And then also hunting horns were made of cattle horn. So the material of the horns as something that was very prevalent in early modern society might correlate to the mythicness of the cuckold horns being like bovine horns versus those Greek Renaissance antlers. And in addition to this, the bovine horn also offers a sumptuary token of moral identity. The horn's physical properties and uses make truths clear, externalizes the internal, and also in a theatrical setting, it gives audiences a position of divine knowing that the participant, that the cuckold on stage does not have. So this is why horns.
Fascinating.
Yes, we're laying the foundation. Why do early modern cuckolds have horns, these bovine horns? And my other reading that I did is an article called No Assembly But Horn Beasts, The Politics of Cuckoldry in Shakespeare's Romantic Comedies by Stephen Cohen. Now, I mentioned at the top of this episode that in Much Ado, cuckoldry, like it does have a explosive point in the wedding scene. Claudio thinks that he has been cuckolded. But it also has a very comic use. There are a lot of jokes that are being made throughout the play, and there's like this streamlined comedy about like the anxieties that Benedict has about being
a married man.
A married man, yeah.
Yeah.
And that counters the tragedies, which I mentioned earlier. In the tragedies, cuckoldry stems from a particular condition that's rooted in like the characters' relationships. In the romantic comedies, cuckoldry is actually a universal condition. It is like laid out and framed as an inevitable consequence of marriage itself. So that's the case in Merchant of Venice, All's Well That Ends Well, and Much Ado. And so one thing that's interesting to note about cuckoldry in these plays is that cuckoldry actually like results in fraternity and memberships of male solidarity under this like understanding that marriage and cuckoldry go hand in hand. And I have another alternative reading of cuckoldry in this play by Cohen. Cohen actually notes that there's a lot of recent work on Elizabethan iconography and work on like the politics of representation in this iconography that centers the language on the politics under Elizabeth. And in particular, this iconography of the queen as spouse of her kingdom. And this involves a language of political critique by her anxious, ambitious, or resistant subjects, particularly in the like last part of Elizabeth's reign.
Why it pops up so much.
Yes. It's widely believed that Elizabeth's success in using her gender identity is widely recognized as due to her exploitation of the doctrine of the king's two bodies. So that is that the king has a political and a divine authority. So they're two separate bodies, the political body and the divine authority. And she did all of that while having a female body natural. And the figure of the monarch as spouse of the country was common in early modern royal iconography, and it reinforced conventional patriarchal hierarchies in the state and the home. And so Elizabeth then inverts this because she is not a king, she's not a prince, she is a queen. And Elizabeth described herself as England's wife, and this underlined the disjunction between the political and the personal, as I said, because of the queen's female natural body. In 1599, she responded to the parliamentary urgings that she marry by using this spousal trope, this like
I'm already married
monarch
to the country,
married to the country. Yeah. She said, quote, "But now that this public care of governing the kingdom is laid upon me, to draw upon me also the cares of marriage may seem a point of inconsiderate folly. Yea, to satisfy you, I have already joined myself in marriage to an husband, namely the kingdom of England." Unquote. And when marriage negotiations with the French Duke of Alençon in 1579 seemed possible, John Stubbs, who we've also talked about, argued that Elizabeth married, there would become a triangular relationship between the queen, the suitor, and her English subjects. So the good wife Elizabeth taking another husband, Alençon, presented dangers expressed by cultural logic and the sexual humiliation rhetoric of cuckoldry.
Right.
And he claims that England, quote, also is to be married with her and in sort to be governed by him that shall be her governor, unquote. So if Elizabeth marries Alençon, then she is under him personally. And then...
Yeah, so then our queen isn't ruling us.
Yeah. And we are ruled
by someone we didn't
agree to in this relationship.
Not that we get to agree to anything, but like as subjects in Elizabeth's England. But yeah, here's somebody that we do not necessarily accept in the same way that we accept the divine right of Elizabeth to rule.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And the 1580s and 90s saw an intensification of competition for royal favor and reward by her courtiers. And it's a kind of like politico-romantic relationship with her subjects. And the result was a form of complaint of romantic frustration and betrayal when that advancement was not forthcoming. And that shows up in like poems and letters and stuff like that from her courtiers.
Mm-hmm.
Both the Earl of Oxford and the Earl of Essex wrote poems couched in courtly frustration. And Sir Walter Raleigh objected to the rise of the new favorite Essex. And yes, Sir Walter Raleigh's poem called Fortune Hath Taken Thee Away, My Love is a poem addressed to Elizabeth. He says, quote, Fortune hath taken thee away, my love's joy and my soul's heaven above. Fortune hath taken thee away, my princess, my world's delight and my true fancy's mistress. Then will I leave my love in fortune's hands. Then will I leave my love in worthless bands, and only love the sorrow due to me, sorrow henceforth that shall my princess be. Unquote.
So it's like on a macro level, the country has these anxieties, and then here we have an example of it in like micro interpersonal between the courtiers.
Yes. Yeah. And the funny thing is that Elizabeth seems to have encouraged this sort of rivalry among her courtiers. And so in response to Raleigh, she encourages him to, quote, pluck up his heart, unquote, and insists that she is not easily won over by Fortune, who is a stand-in for Essex.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So like she also knew that there was this socio-political anxiety in Elizabeth's courtiership that evoked the logic of cuckoldry, and any courtier within her sphere knew that there was a reversibility of the cuckoldry trope, because if you won Elizabeth, then there was also the chance that you could then lose her and you were in constant fear of cuckoldry to another courtier if she makes that courtier her favorite. So that was going on like in the political realm of England during Elizabeth's reign. And yeah, the gender political rhetoric of Elizabeth and her male subjects, the courtiers, is registered in the romantic comedies through their unusual emphasis on cuckoldry. The comedies partake of an upsurge of misogynistic discourse during the last decade of Elizabeth's reign, and this ranges from like sexually explicit rumors to pornographic poems to a literary fascination with monstrous sexually voracious women. And, you know, correlation and causation, we don't fully know.
We don't really know, yeah.
It's one of those like, it's like, oh, okay, so we've got a woman monarch and we have male courtiers who are fighting for her favor, and there's drama about like who she's going to marry. And then, look at this. The arts are also putting this into their like themes, motifs that's underlying.
Yes.
Yeah. And so as we explore Much Ado, or if you go back and look at Much Ado, the comedies, unlike I said, those tragedies that have a lot of violence, they react to this threat of cuckoldry through resignation, universalization, and fraternal valorization. So these characters acknowledge the political fact of male subordination to a powerful woman. Cohen does not argue in his article that the characters are representations of the queen and her courtiers, but rather, like I said earlier, it's like an exploration that there's this short-lived phenomenon and this trend of like the eternal cuckolds, like a brotherhood of cuckolds. And in Much Ado, Benedict equates matrimony and cuckoldry. He's also really obsessed with this like brotherhood, whether it be none of us are going to marry, we're all going to be bachelors, or at the end, he's like, Don Pedro, come join us, like, get thee a wife. There is no staff more reverend than one tipped with horn. And so, like, this, like, fraternal.
It's okay to be a cuckold, to, like, put yourself at this, almost like to accept the risk that being married brings, whether or not, like, it actually happens.
Yeah. And also, all of your friends are here, man. We're all in this club together. We have membership, and you should come join us because we're all here. And it's an ending. It's like a final line that's always struck me as very strange. Like, I don't really know how to unpack the line of like, Benedict resists marriage because he's afraid of the inevitable cuckoldry. And then he falls in love. And then at the end, he still thinks that cuckoldry is inevitable.
Yeah. Is he saying that love is worth it, or that marriage is worth the likely chance this will happen to you?
Especially considering we just found out that Hero actually was not cheating on Claudio, and Claudio is not a cuckold.
Yeah.
But either way, throughout the play, there is this obsession with cuckoldry, and we have that through the language of horns and all of that kind of stuff. And Beatrice also similarly equates matrimony and cuckoldry when she tells her father and uncle, quote, "Too cursed is more cursed. I shall lessen God's sending that way, for it is said, God sends a cursed cow short horns, but to a cow too cursed he sends none," unquote. So she's also like, God is going to send women cuckolds because it's like inevitable that women are going to be cuckolding, and she's going to choose to not marry to like not have this curse of creating a cuckold of her husband.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting this, because ultimately cuckoldry, we're talking about, you know, infidelity, and we definitely have plenty of representations of men being unfaithful, participating in infidelity through the number of bastards. There's a bastard in this play. And yet the greater anxiety of like, at any time women could be accused of cuckoldry. That's the thing, is that it doesn't even have to have happened. Is something that this play calls out, is that like, yes, everybody says that like it's going to happen. Somebody's going to cheat on somebody in a marriage, basically. But women can be falsely accused of cuckoldry, and we never, like, how do you really know?
Yeah. And I think across the board, at least the heroines that we're supposed to think they're chaste and good women who are good wives, when they get accused, it always turns out that there was a plot against them and they're not. So the like repeat presence of cuckoldry as this underlying anxiety, butting heads with Shakespeare's women not doing that.
Yeah, is there a possibility that this inclusion of this trope, while the trope itself is sexist, what it's placed up against is it constantly being found to be a false accusation. And so, like, for a time machine to figure out what was kind of being pointed out or teased at, like, are we not just making fun of the cuckold, or are we making fun of the man who believes himself to be a cuckold and then acts a certain way when his wife is a faithful wife?
Right.
We see a lot more faithful wives in Shakespeare than like true unfaithful wives.
Yeah. And maybe Shakespeare, the smart playwright who's just up on trends, is like, I know that cuckoldry is going to make people laugh, so let's give the people what they want.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyways, that was my reading on cuckoldry.
Oh, okay. Well, great. Well, I have another trope from early modern English drama and early modern art, early modern European art in general, for us to take a look at, and that is women at windows. So my reading for this comes from Cynthia Lewis's "You Were an Actor with Your Handkerchief, Women, Windows, and Moral Agency." So women at windows, which we hear about in this play, is the idea that Hero talked with a man at her window, and that is proof enough that she is unfaithful, right? But what does this even mean? So first of all, as I said, women at windows were a trope throughout art, both on stage and off. We can see in the mid-17th century, post-dating Shakespeare, some early modern visual artists, early modern painters depicting women at windows. Some key examples are Bartolomé Esteban Murillo's painting Two Women at a Window, as well as Rembrandt's Young Girl Leaning on a Windowsill, which is also known as Young Girl at a Window. as well as Rembrandt's The Kitchen Maid and a few others. We also see, you may remember, Juliet speaks with Romeo out of her window.
Oh.
Oh.
Oh, another
Recall?
a girl at a window. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And Leslie Thompson, in her article, Window Scenes in Renaissance Plays, A Survey and Some Conclusions, catalogs 60 plays from the early modern era that, quote, either in stage directions or dialogue, or both, make specific mention of upper-level windows, that is, exterior windows in the context of the action, not an interior gallery, unquote. The two most frequent uses of a window are observation scenes and wooing scenes.
Mm.
So observation scenes where someone on the street is observing something in the window above, and wooing scenes, Romeo and Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
And Lewis goes on to talk about how, we don't know why or how common women at windows were in culture. What they do create is a liminal space, a crossing or a moral juncture, especially within the context of the theater. Scholar Hannah Skolnikov explains that the window is a boundary between, quote, the interior, domestic, and the female realm on the one hand, and the outer, public male world on the other, unquote. Lewis also points out that despite the blatant sexism in plays that feature a woman at a window, they also signal actions that are fraught with moral considerations and questions both, quote, the nature and uses of women's judgment and free will, unquote, and how men are substantially involved in the undoing of women. All that to say,
Mm-hmm.
the idea of a woman at a window, scholars think it is tied to this sort of an exchange that is happening between the male world and the female world. And these plays are examining what happens when women use their judgment and free will through those windows, and how much men, like we see in Much Ado About Nothing, are involved in the ruination of women when it does happen, and how they are often at fault for what they do. Also, it's important to know that in this play, the scene is technically absent, although often staged, so we hear about it. And Lewis says that, quote, Margaret's character comes under scrutiny, and her awareness and agency in the matter of Claudio's deception are key, unquote, for the plot of this play. A character that we have not talked about yet, Margaret. Critic Mark Taylor assumes Margaret's innocence and asserts that both Leonato and Claudio, quote, heap their misogyny upon a helpless woman, while only Borachio has the manly courage to defend the guiltless Margaret, unquote. Lewis, in her article, argues, on the other hand, that assuming Margaret is completely oblivious and not suspicious of Borachio at all is more sexist than assuming, like Leonato does, that Margaret must have some idea about the effect her actions could have. Lewis notes that Taylor completely omits that Leonato has a final vindication of Margaret in the last scene. This is what Leonato says, quote, Margaret was in some fault for this, although against her will, as it appears in the true course of all the question, unquote. And while Borachio has previously said Margaret's completely innocent, she knew nothing. The play allows for both Leonato and Borachio to be correct. Margaret is partially responsible, however, not intentionally culpable. She wasn't part of the premeditation of this plan, but she likely knew what she was doing, especially if Borachio is true, and he has her call him Claudio, which Claudio, in the descriptions of how this scene happens, is close enough to recognize Borachio, and in theory, does he hear Margaret call Borachio Claudio? He must not, because then that would be a clue that something is off.
Yeah.
So that is Women at Windows. It's a trope. We don't know exactly why it was so fascinating, but it is this space where women are often forced to make choices through that window. And we see it also in Shakespeare in Merchant of Venice, which we haven't talked about yet, but Jessica's choice to steal from her father and run away happens through a window.
Yeah. That does make sense considering what we know about like young unmarried, or at least unmarried, but unmarried women and unmarried men, and the roles, like the spaces that they occupied or were technically allowed to be seen occupying. And like in the Romeo and Juliet series, we talked about like young guys and how like they were out in the world, and how young women young girls had to like have boys over secretly to get to know them without supervision. So
Talk at the window, right?
the window. So that does make a lot of sense to me why that would be the space where all this stuff happens, because it's like the one space I guess where Margaret could do something like this.
It's the one space where probably she can see Baraccio if they
Yeah.
have a pre-existing relationship.
Mm-hmm. Because she's a waiting woman, so she wouldn't be able to like meet up with him
Not like they're
outside.
going to be dancing at the masquerade ball.
Yeah. Yeah, so there would be rules for how she can interact with young men.
Exactly. Just to talk about Margaret a little bit more, she kind of operates a space that is in between, on the spectrum of womanhood, in between Hero and Beatrice,
Mhm.
because she is not getting married to Baraccio. She is, at the end of this play, lightly shamed for her actions.
Mm-hmm. That's really, I think, an eye-opening way to look at Margaret and her agency, her form of agency. Just as a thing we can explore later, I have read that the reason why she would make the choice to pretend to be like, calling out to Claudio has something to do with like a role play
Yes.
beyond her social rank.
Yeah, I have also read similar. There's a lot of speculation because we don't hear from Margaret why she agrees to do this, or if this is something that they regularly do, role play as others. But
Yeah.
we do, see after that scene has taken place off stage, the next time we do see her, she is admiring Hero's clothing and the wedding dress and commenting on what Hero should wear. And so there does seem to be perhaps some sort of desire to be Hero or be in Hero's position.
Yeah, but either way, it happens out a window.
It happens out a window. But to speak more on kind of the spectrum of women in this play, in most productions, we'll have Hero on one end of the dutiful daughter and Beatrice on the other. And then, as I said, Ursula and Margaret kind of operate somewhere in between. And this reading is from Michael D. Friedman's Hushed on Purpose to Grace Harmony, Wives in Silence and Much Ado About Nothing. And Friedman notes that in Shakespeare's comedies, we often see female power, quote, such as that wielded by Beatrice, often paradoxically serves to consolidate the status quo of male hierarchy, and is almost routinely surrendered to their husbands when they marry, unquote. Wives are supposed to speak kindly and softly to men, as I've said, like Hero. And in contrast, Beatrice is very talkative and witty, and wit throughout the play is described as a piercing or penetrating and therefore phallic and masculine weapon. And wit, quote, retains its phallic masculine character even when appropriated by women, unquote. So for the first half of the play, Beatrice wields wit as aggressively as the men, and Benedict comments on it. She speaks poniards. He's felt every blow as a piercing blow.
Mm-hmm.
As we talked about during what you brought on cuckoldry, there's some commentary on the balance of power in marriage. Both Beatrice and Benedict are against it. Beatrice comments on the, quote, unequal balance of power between the genders which prevails within marriage, unquote. She expresses, quote, genuine longing for the type of inclusion in society which marriage allows, coupled with resentment, unquote. She doesn't want it, but then she also, is saying things like, I will sit and cry hey-ho for a husband. But she does not believe that a man exists who she would feel comfortable being subservient to without it feeling like an insult to be subservient to.
Yeah, him. She wants like men to be made of more metal or mettle. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So someone who is a true superior to her, and she says men aren't, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Coming back to Margaret, on the morning of the wedding, Margaret takes up that usage of wit linguistically as Beatrice begins to soften towards Benedict, and Beatrice also happens to be kind of out of commission with a head cold. And this is also, again, after Margaret has spoken with Baraccio at night at Hero's chamber window. So in the eyes of the men of Messina, Margaret starts to commit two kinds of speech infractions that are outside the bounds of acceptable female behavior. Speaking with a man at the window at night, and also using this masculine, witty language from there on out. And the men comment on it. She says some things to Benedict, and he's like, whoa, Margaret.
Like when she's asking him to like write her a sonnet or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's like, I like Beatrice.
Yeah.
So we've got these like witty women, and then we've got these silent women. And then on the other spectrum there's this line, about 29 lines before the play ends, "Peace, I will stop your mouth" in Act 5, Scene 4. And editors and directors commonly give this line to Benedick. However, Shakespeare scholar Edward Barry, quote, has drawn attention to a textual crux that allows an alternative to the traditional blocking of the exchange, pointing out that both the Quarto and Folio asserted that Leonato should step in and initiate the kiss that brings the two lovers together, just as another third party, Beatrice, gives directions for Hero and Claudio's kiss at their betrothal, unquote. This line we've talked about can often feel problematic because after it is said, especially if it is said by Benedick, Beatrice does not speak again for the remaining 29 lines of the play. And how do we, as modern Shakespeare practitioners, deal with the shutting up of a woman who has been very strong and feels like she should definitely have things to say about getting married after the agreement to get married?
Right.
But she doesn't, nor does Hero have lines after to forgive Claudio or accept his apology, right? And Friedman notes that Shakespeare's audiences, because they believed wives should be quiet, subservient, that was the cultural norm, or the cultural
expectation,
the expectation,
yeah,
the ideal, the thing that was like, this is the ideal wife
that people
right?
were told their wives should do.
Right. To the extent that wives actually did that,
we don't know.
Cannot say.
Yeah.
But they may have found that surrender of Beatrice's tongue to be very relevant to the questions of wives in silence. However, modern directors kind of need to, if they want to engage with this idea of wives in silence, they kind of need to intentionally highlight that this is maybe not a romantic moment. Friedman suggests that one approach could be based in acknowledging a silent character who is included in Quarto and Folio stage directions, but who has no lines and is not referred to by name at any time. Quote, according to both texts, two figures in the play's first entrance are Leonato, governor of Messina, and Imogen, his wife. The phrase, his wife, then reoccurs in the list of entering characters for Act 2, Scene 1, but in neither of these scenes, nor anywhere else in the play, does Imogen speak. Unquote.
So, Leonato has a live wife?
So, Leonato has a living wife. Often this play is put in the collection of plays with no moms.
I thought that she was a dead mom.
At least according to the editors of the Folio and the Quartos, the original editors, there's supposed to be a silent wife character. Editors as early as 1733 have omitted Imogen, claiming, quote, there is no mention of her through the play, unquote. Although not accurate, because Leonato, as we've mentioned, does references Hero's mother in Act 1, Scene 1, and further says that Hero fathers herself, so she resembles her father, which proves Imogen's wifely chastity, that Hero looks so much like Leonato that there's no question of that joke that he tells. He is purely and obviously joking
with Benedick, who is clearly anxious about this. Yeah.
Again, so he's providing a counter argument to, well, everybody's going to be cuckolded. Editors have also argued, quote, how is the audience supposed to know that she's the mother or the aunt or the grandmother if she doesn't say anything and no one directly addresses her, unquote. However, Friedman notes that this is to assume that, quote, the meaning of the play is transmitted to an audience wholly in verbal terms, but it is quite easy on stage to indicate a figure's relationship to other characters by visual means alone, unquote. Friedman then goes on to explain, potentially to these editors of the past, that, Leonato could gesture, Imogen could gesture, or react in a way that tells the audience she is his wife and Hero's mother. In the nicest way, Friedman explains how performing a play works.
Yeah, go see a play, nerds.
Friedman then goes on to talk about what if Imogen is present in the rest of the scenes. If Imogen is present in 4-1, then she must conspicuously support Leonato and keep silent when Leonato has his upset over Claudio's accusation towards Hero. This would again reinforce her as an ideal Elizabethan wife who possessed all those virtues of chastity, obedience, and silence. And Friedman also suggests that having her present at the end of the play placing her alongside Hero and Beatrice, that a director could stage something to, quote, associate Beatrice and Hero with the play's paragon of wifely virtues, and thus imply their own acceptance of the subservient role she represents, unquote. Now, that's a way to acknowledge that there's this like silent wife idea happening.
Mm-hmm.
However, I'm sure not all modern directors love the idea of subordination and silencing of the heroine. And those directors, Friedman explains, can also cut passages and contradict the dialogue or choose to highlight and, quote, problematize the notion of wifely subservience, unquote, instead of purely accept it.
Yeah.
I also want to highlight, I was just up in Ashland, Oregon, and they are producing Much Ado About Nothing this year, and the choice that director, Miriam A. Laub, chose to make for this 2024 production was to reassign some of Benedict's final lines to Beatrice and to add an additional final speech for Hero to allow both of these women to speak at the end. And I found the reassigning some of Benedict's final lines to Beatrice especially effective in overcoming this silent wife situation.
Yeah, this kind of like potential reading of like the taming of Beatrice, if you will.
Right. Like if we want to completely avoid that, it does work to have her say things like, we'll devise brave punishments for him, you know?
Yeah.
With that is some of the gender-based tropes that are present in this play, where they come from, how to potentially deal with them, because this play is funny and does have value. There's just a couple things that when producing it, we want to address.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense as we bring a bunch of research in, like make less problematic some of the things that are problematic, but also play with things like why Shakespeare, why now? You know?
Right.
What can you say if you explore some of these?
Yeah. What are we saying when we produce it? Yeah.
Yeah. It's still a great play that's very fun. Keep doing it, just intentionally.
How can we address the sexism and engage with it in a way that doesn't reinforce it?
Exactly.
And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone?
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, follow us on Instagram at Shakespeare Anyone Pod, or Twitter at Shakespeare Anyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare Any and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you. From Othello, Act 2, Scene 3, said by Iago. I had rather this tongue cut from my mouth than it should do offense to Michael Cassio.